Hello and welcome to this episode of not Star Wars, Star Trek. Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. One thing we like to talk about a lot is the idea of consequences. That, it's great to see the fight scenes, but sometimes when we see people get wounded, we see people go through really traumatic stuff, and they're sad for an episode, but then everything goes back to normal, it doesn't actually feel that realistic. Well, Star Trek DS9, in one of the best episodes, well regarded within DS9, and by many people thought of in the top 10 of all Star Trek episodes, in the episode Only a Paper Moon, Season 7, Episode 10, they actually really explore in some beautiful ways the effects of trauma, the effects of amputation, the effects of coming to terms with life after war and after a catastrophic injury. And we're talking about that here with my co-host, Riki Hayashi. And for folks who aren't DS9 fans or just saw this episode many years ago, don't worry, we'll be giving you a quick summary. But just jumping right in, Riki, this was an episode you had originally suggested. Tell us a little bit about why you want to talk about this episode.
Any chance to talk about Star Trek
Yeah.
is excellent for me. If you listen to our episode on Section 31, the movie, even though I hadn't personally watched the movie, I had just like the background information in Star Trek, like I know it all. And so like I sometimes come off that way, I know, as a know-it-all, like when I recite like episode titles and stuff. That's just like, it is my most nerdy passion. Like I think I like Star Wars, the franchise, better, but Star Trek is where I love to get into just like the fandom of it.
Yeah, I can see that. No, that totally makes sense. And yeah, I love Star Trek. I think I've said before, I know I've said before many times that my mother showing me Star Trek and asking me ethical questions about it as a kid was really the birthplace of this podcast, as well as so many of my sort of interests and loves when it comes to how all this plays out. And so let me give kind of a brief summary of this episode. So this is set in the last season of DS9. Forgive spoilers for a 20-year-old show, 30-year-old show at this point. We are deep into the Dominion War, and one of the characters who has gone off to war is Nog. Nog is a Ferengi. He is the son of Rom, who is the brother of Quark, the person who runs the casino and restaurant and all that and bar at DS9. Nog was a character who was originally introduced to us as a haha, look at how sexist and terrible and awful Ferengi men are, and has gone through an incredible evolution to the point where he became a member of Starfleet and a member of the military, and went off to war, and has now come back from the war, badly injured. He had lost a leg, and has now a prosthetic leg, a bioprosthetic leg, but still a story that I, as a person who lost my leg amputated, very much relate to, and I'll get to that. And everyone around him is ready to just sort of like celebrate the hero and move on. And he is not. He is still in a place of deep trauma about all of this. And he winds up finding that the only place he feels safe and comfortable is the holodeck. And specifically, a holodeck program that's been running where it's basically about the golden age of Vegas, the kind of days of like Frankie Sinatra and all the crooners, the 1950s, 1960s. And they've invented a character who's very much part of that Brat Pack era called Vic Fontaine. And Nog basically spends a lot of his time with Vic, working with him, like helping him to rebuild his casino. And there's a lot of debate about like, is this good for him or bad for him? And, eventually it shows that like, yes, actually this is very healing for him and helps him with his trauma, until it gets to a point where he's kind of stuck there. And it's gone from being helping to enabling. And Vic Fontaine himself is the one who kind of helps to push Nog back out into the world, and goes out into the world. And while the idea that PTSD is all solved in one episode is kind of ridiculous, it is still one of the only real treatments of this that I've seen, especially in a show that isn't thought of as like super dark and gritty, but more like a Star Trek show. And so yeah, there's just a lot to talk about. But Riki, did I cover most of the major plot points? We'll get into more details as we go on for sure.
Yeah, I'll just go over. You mentioned it was season 7, episode 10, The story is by David Mack and John J. Ordover. The teleplay, meaning kind of like the final script, was by Ronald D. Moore, who is like the architect of Deep Space Nine in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
and it was directed by Anson Williams. The previous episode, right, where you mentioned Nog was injured, is also one of the best in Deep Space Nine, dealing with like the realities of war, the siege of AR 558. We see Nog go from kind of wide-eyed and excited to then like being scared, and then finally like in the end just injured and broken. And in that moment, I believe when he's like waiting for surgery or something like that, like he's on a surgical bed or something,
Uh-huh.
he's listening to Vic Fontaine's music, I think,
Right.
is the connection to why he ends up retreating into the hollow suite
Right.
world of the Las Vegas casino.
Yeah. Very much so. And let me just talk about the character of Nog himself for a minute, because I
Oh
think
yeah.
the fact that it is Nog who goes through all this is very important, because as I said, Nog was really presented as comic relief and as a reminder that the Ferengi are different and weird and bad. And
Mm-hmm.
frankly, it's not my, or I think a lot of people's favorite part of the early parts of DS9, because in a TV tactic that Star Trek was by no means unique in, that was done all the time, there's a lot of like, we're going to have a character be super sexist and super awful, but don't worry about it because we're doing it to mock him. But yeah, he is the traditional Ferengi male, who, if you don't know, they're a species that believes that like men are the only ones out in society. They're very much kind of like supposed to be like 19th century robber barons of American capitalism, but taken to an nth extreme. So women are
Yeah,
supposed to stay home and never go out in public and never talk to anyone. They're
they
all
aren't allowed to wear clothes
I don't know where to look
as
clothes
a
exactly.
society.
And he's just really, part of the show is about the Ferengi having to live in community with everyone else. It's about everyone living in community with everyone else. And he responds really badly to it. And over the years, they've given him more and more to do and allowed him to become part of Starfleet, and that he kind of wanted to go into Starfleet Command. He's the first Ferengi to do so. I will say Star Trek loves the first. So we've had so many characters who were the first of their race to do a
Worf.
thing, which is definitely pretty good. Yeah, Worf. I think the Trill was like one of the first Trills to go into Star Trek. I think B'Elanna from Bajor. We had a lot of these kind of things, and he gets that kind of arc, but it's always still a little, oh, haha, this, because among other things, he's very short. The actor, I think, is a little person, and the
I
character is maybe like 4 foot tall, maybe
I
less than that.
I don't think he's that short. I want to
Is
say. Well, the actor is Aaron Eisenberg, who sadly did pass away several years ago. Rest in peace.
right?
Um, I agree. Like he's short,
Yeah.
but I don't know. I
Okay.
don't know if maybe we should confirm or
Let me
cut
look
this
that up.
out
I thought I had
because I
read.
want to be respectful.
No, understand. I thought his medical problems were in part because of his dwarfism, but I will look it up and I will redo that part. Okay, yeah, I was somewhat correct, but I will redo that one. Among other things, Nog is a very short character. He's played by Aaron Eisenberg, who has sadly passed away, but it was a very good actor, especially in this issue, in this episode. And he was someone who had kidney problems as a teenager, and that stopped his growth at 5 foot. So, but he really makes that an important part of the character. And in this, I think the fact that it was Nog means so much, because part of the issue I think that happens is that by joining Starfleet, remember, everyone around him had said, don't do this. This is a wrong idea. This is terrible. And I think that definitely adds to the feelings he's going through, because, when you're the person who says, I can do something that everyone else says you shouldn't do and you can't do, and then you wind up doing it and something terrible happens, that only adds, I think, in a lot of ways to the trauma of it and the feeling of like, did I make a terrible mistake? And why, the world wasn't as safe for me as I thought it was. Because I think, as you kind of mentioned, he's kind of wide-eyed and innocent, and he says that he definitely has a sense of like, I'm watching this trauma happening to other people, but I had that kind of like young person invincibility feeling, like that it could never happen to me. And I think the fact that it's him and that he's a Ferengi and that he's so out of his element means a lot in terms of why he then, after this accident, after this war wound, needs to kind of go back into kind of the cocoon of his own making of like, this is my safe place.
Yeah, Nog to me, like this whole show, I could go on and on about why I love Deep Space Nine. One of the reasons is the redemption of the Ferengi race. They were
Yeah,
introduced in Star Trek: The Next Generation, and like a lot of alien races in Star Trek, they quickly became a monoculture caricature, right?
yeah,
Klingons are all about honor. Romulans are all about treachery. The Ferengi are all about profit,
right.
and like they have a societal religion almost, I guess, where they
Mm-hmm.
base everything around the rules of acquisition. You may have heard, there's a numbered like 200 or something, 250 rules of acquisition that they
Right.
all adhere to, and they're like little quippy sayings about how to make money.
Yeah, it's basically their Bible. And if you think about
Yeah,
how someone will be like, well, Luke 16:42 says,
yeah.
they do that with the rules of acquisition.
And Nog and his father, Rom, both break away from this profit-based mentality.
Right.
Rom joins the engineering staff and he becomes an engineer on the station, he said. And, Nog joins Starfleet and ultimately becomes a soldier in this case, because they're at war with the Dominion. And that's very important because, again, like, not every Ferengi should just be about profit, right? Not
Yeah.
every Klingon should be a warrior in a
Yeah.
more realistic setting. And these are shorthands that the show develops so that we have something to lean on. But when you have the time to develop a character like this, it's
Mm-hmm.
really so much better.
Well, and that's why, and it's funny. I remember watching this episode and mostly being struck by the trauma and the amputation aspects of it all. Also, and we're going to get to that. We have a lot to say about that. But just going a little deeper on this, because I really noticed it on this watch through that I did last night. I think, given everything we've just said, it is so interesting that what Nog does, again, it's all this fictional world where it doesn't actually matter. But in the fictional world, they've created the idea that Vic Fontaine is struggling with his finances.
Yeah.
And Nog winds up helping him with that and coming up with actually all of these profit-laden plans. And specifically says at one point when Vic says, like, are you sure you're going to be good enough to take over the books? And he says, I'm a Ferengi. It's in my blood. And that line hit me so hard because I do think that is often a strong trauma response, especially after, trying to leave, like, what your family taught you or what your culture taught you, and you've gone out into the world and something bad has happened. Often part of the first response can be, okay, let me go back. Let me go back to where everything was safe. And I, it just, they don't lampshade that. I'm taking a small little tidbit and reading a lot into it, but it felt like it was very intentional to have that little moment of part of his response to all this is going back to being a Ferengi in that kind of a way. And to be clear, he doesn't go back to any of the sexism or any of the awful stuff, but just that idea of like, I'm a Ferengi, I'm good at profit, becomes a big part of his like comfort zone.
Yeah, and I found it a good way to utilize that monoculture
Yeah.
trait, right? It is still, when you think about it, kind of ridiculous, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you have that upbringing, he at least was like exposed to enough things. And I think that's what they're saying is like, it's
Right.
not racially in their blood,
Yeah.
but that he grew up in this culture that
Right.
magnified profit to this degree. So being put in this situation, even though it's 1950s Las Vegas Earth simulation, he understands, the basics of what to do.
Right. And I think it's also a nice statement again on this, because I think you're right. The monoculture ideas are not very realistic, but also then the idea of, I will reject my monoculture, and so my whole culture will be about the rejection of that. that does happen in the real world, but it's not
Mhm.
often the healthiest perspective. And that, I mean, it can be in some ways, to be sure, but sometimes people find the best sort of path when they're able to say, I'm rejecting all of the repression, I'm rejecting all of the things that taught me to not like myself or whatever, but I'm also accepting that there were things about how I grew up or my culture or my connections that I do love or that I do relate to outside of everything else that was on top of it. And I think that that's a part of where he goes.
Yeah, I agree. And now that we're talking about it, I feel like this is actually maybe a representation of diaspora, like
Yeah,
in the real world, where you see, like for me as an Asian American, like you see how the generation born or that came, after immigration to America from Asia,
right.
a lot of these people who grew up in the US and that's kind of all they know have this moment of like, but I do kind of want to go back and reconnect with my roots. And
Yeah,
that's what he's doing because he grew up on Deep Space Nine among Bajorans and humans and not among Ferengi, right?
right.
So since maybe like early teens.
Hmm.
And so he's having this moment of reconnecting with his culture in a healthy, positive way, as
Yeah,
you said, and not the misogynistic aspects of the culture.
right. So let's talk actually then about the what happens to him and the trauma, the PTSD, and the losing of his leg. And I will name from the beginning that I have a very biased perspective, obviously, on this because I can relate to what he's going through about halfway. In that I did have in that I did lose my leg to amputation, and a lot of the things, and it was very traumatic, and a lot of the things that he goes through are very similar to what I've gone through. But of course, I've never been to war. There's very different circumstances in which how I lost my leg, and I would not claim to have like war caused PTSD in any of the same ways. But but it's certainly something I know quite a lot about, and done a lot of counseling with folks in that world, and my own mental stuff is very similar to PTSD. So just some of the things that I noticed early on. One was just this whole idea of how everyone was unsure of what to say to him, and that there were things that people were saying. Well, let me ask you, like, what was your response to people like his family and Jake and Jake's girlfriend, Kiara, trying to sort of offer him words of help and him rejecting them?
It was painful to watch. And
Yeah,
obviously, like, that's the point in this episode. But what I really felt was so many of those characters were civilians, right?
yeah,
And I don't recall like if there was like a Starfleet like soldier character who tried to reach out to him. Like did Chief O'Brien talk to him? Because that's who I would think of as like a veteran who has
hmm,
seen war and like has had some trauma over it. Like we saw in
yeah.
I think Next Generation, where he has like a very racist response to Cardassians because he fought against them.
Yeah, and he does talk to O'Brien briefly, but it's about
Okay.
Vic Fontaine, and we'll get to that.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah.
about
Oh
Dolores.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you picked up on that because I do think a lot of the times this is portrayed as everyone around the person is doing their absolute best and is saying really helpful, good things, but the person with PTSD is being a jerk and rejecting them all.
Hmm.
And I do think everyone is trying their best. Do think everyone is trying to help. But I think what this show portrayed and what I really related to, because how I experienced, is that people are actually really bad at knowing what's a good way to speak to someone after something like this. And not that they should, because it probably takes a lot of training to have a good idea. But like, there's one scene where Jake and the girl he's dating at that moment, I think her name was Kiara, something like that. I might get it wrong, but Jake
Yeah,
goes off.
unfortunately, like Jake has a lot of girlfriends of the week,
Yes,
so to
they
speak.
kind of cycle through. Um, and Jake goes off to use the refresher, which is their sort of very polite way of saying goes to the bathroom. And he's left there with Kiara, and Kiara's clearly trying to be curious, but trying to be helpful, but also she's clearly very curious, and she's kind of like dancing around what she's trying to say. And he catches her like staring at his legs, trying to figure out which is the real one and which is the bioprosthetic one. And that moment hit me like a ton of bricks
Mm.
because I have had, I mean, I think it's like pretty clear with me that I have a prosthetic leg that is pretty obvious, but just this idea of people like wanting to ask questions that I think might be rude, but kind of dancing around it and wanting me to be the one to jump in and just, and it may be that I'm like Nog being a little unfair to folks because I don't expect people to know how to do it, but I could tell that those scenes were written by someone who at least knew someone who had been through moments like this, of like the soldier coming home and no one knowing how to talk to them, of the person who's gone through a major injury and no one knows how to relate to them. Because I felt they did this really good job of showing that Nog needs help and he's not really being very pleasant to people around him, but also that there's some justification in that the people around him are trying, but are kind of just making things worse.
Yeah, you really feel that in this episode, and there's kind of like a jokey thing, right? Like where when someone is depressed,
Yep.
there's like oh, have you tried not being depressed, right? Like that's obviously not the solution, but
Right.
often people say things very similar to that in a way that is just like condescending and not understanding of the situation. So yeah, it definitely felt that in this episode
Mm-hmm.
of
Yeah.
people being uncomfortable and not really knowing what to do.
Yeah.
And that's what made like the Vic Fontaine thing work, right? Like he goes into the holosuite and Vic, the character, treats him completely differently, or maybe not differently is the point.
Right.
Treats him normally.
Yeah, he treats him the way he would have beforehand,
Yeah.
and is kind of aware of the leg, but doesn't. And there's an interesting back and forth there because, so this is after the Trill has switched to a new person. It's no longer Jadzia Dax. It's
Esri Dax.
Esri Dax. Thank you. And her role is to be the ship's counselor, the station's counselor, kind of like what B'Elanna Troy was on Next Generation. And she at first is like, no, this is fundamentally unhealthy. This is bad. And Vic has to kind of convince her that no, actually what they're doing for Nog is helping. Because among other things, he's trying to help him kind of like not just sit around and mope, but try to make him more active, feel more confident about himself. And what's presented as kind of the MacGuffin of the episode is this idea that his prosthetic leg, it's a bioprosthetic leg, so it should be completely fine, but that Nog has a lot of pain about it and walks with a cane. And in one of my favorite lines in the show, he at one point says that he knows that everyone else feels like, and the quote is, the problem's all in my head, that I'm crazy. And it's never quite returned to, but I feel like part of what the episode gets at is that, yes, it all is all in his head, but he's not crazy. And for me as someone, I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but I think it's relevant. I've often talked about that I don't like science fiction that says that we have a disabled character, but because of technology or magic or science or whatever, the disability basically goes away.
Yeah.
And here, they have a level of scientific possibility of the prosthetic wildly beyond what we have in our own world. I can't relate to that. But the idea of a prosthetic feeling like it doesn't fit, even if it technically does, because it's just it's not your body. You are still getting used to it in ways that are difficult, and that there are phantom pains, and that there are feelings and people telling you it's all in your head. Ask any amputee and they probably can watch that scene and be like, yep, that's my experience right there on screen. And good.
Well, I was gonna say like that phrase phantom pain, right, is like if you've lost a limb, you still think that you feel things there, like pain.
Right.
Even though there's physically nothing, no nerves there.
Well, and technically, like there is a degree to which, yeah, it can be entirely psychological, but also sometimes it's that there are nerves there, but they just dead end into like dead skin or whatever, and so there are random firings of
impulses. Yeah,
exactly. So, and obviously we don't know the science, the biology of his leg, but I thought that was just a really effective way of making his experience one that a lot of other people can relate to. And so anyway, so back to the main topic. Vic kind of gives him this newer cane that's like cool and awesome. It has a lighter so he can light women's cigarettes. It's the 1950s. It's a very different time. And but but the idea being that it doesn't actually support his weight, and he's going to start, and also as he gets more excited about things, kind of forgetting that he needs the cane, which is a time honored, very good psychological tool. And you know, for a long time, Vic Fontaine's actually does heal Nog in a lot of important ways.
Yeah, and there's a beautiful shot of like panning back to the cane, just like sitting there, like leaning against something, right? Like to end the
Yeah.
scene, to remind us or show us, like, oh, hey, yeah, he doesn't need that anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so maybe this is the right spot to say, because you mentioned Esri Dax, who
Mm-hmm.
comes aboard as the station's counselor, and continues this time-honored tradition in Star Trek of mental health professionals being kind of bad at their jobs,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Like Counselor Troy in Next Generation was so badly used as a character.
She had no boundaries. She had no professional boundaries. It was awful.
And there were so many episodes where characters end up going to Guinan, the
Yeah.
bartender of 10 Forward, for guidance. So this is like, to me, feels like a similar situation where
Yeah.
the mental health professional, the person trained in this field, is just kind of fumbling the situation, and a non-professional, like casual, like bartender, casino owner character just happens to like know the right things to say and the right things to do for this person.
Right.
And I that is my least favorite part of this episode. Is
Well,
as Esri Dax, like at the very end, I think like, oh yeah, like talks to Vix, like you were right, like you had the right track. But in the beginning, she just seems so again, like bad at her job.
yeah. I definitely hear where you're coming from, and I want to get to that. Let me just
Yeah,
mention one or
sure.
two things about the trauma as well that I just again thought were perfect. Um, there's a moment where he's watching Shane, the old John Wayne movie,
Mm,
which the idea that people in the 2020s or the 22 whatever 23 whatever of this show, fans are yelling at me that I don't know the exact dates right now, but that they would still remember this John Wayne movie seems pretty weird. But the idea that people in the 1950s would be watching that on television makes total sense. Um, but in that movie, like a lot of cowboy movies, like a lot of action movies, both then and today, the character gets injured and then 5 minutes later is having his big goodbye with a pretty girl, and there's just no mention of his injury. And Nog says, quote, "Wasn't he shot just a few minutes ago? He's not even bleeding." And this is something I'm not sure. Again, having not been in war myself, I don't relate to quite as much. Although I do feel it like when Misty Knight puts on a new prosthetic arm and everything is perfect. But I've definitely heard from a lot of others just that when you've seen actual war, when you've seen actual violence of whatever kind, seeing the way it's presented on TV and in movies, where there's so little consequence, like yeah, you're shot, but then you just tie up your arm and everything's fine, really drives people crazy.
yeah, it drives me crazy.
Yeah, I can get that. And there's another one other thing that they mentioned that I thought was really powerful, because again, showing this, I think there was a while of like every villain on TV or in movies had PTSD, and it was kind of presented as kind of like this terrible thing. And I think now there's more sympathy of like PTSD can lead to bad outcomes if people aren't treated, but we're not demonizing people with it anymore. But I like that again, he is shown being a jerk to a lot of folks, and that one of the primary ways it happens is he becomes very self-focused. Like he assumes that he can stay with Vic forever because he doesn't think for a minute about what Vic might want in a situation. He kind of assumes that like everyone else, like that their needs are going to become sublimated to what he needs most in terms of his family, in terms of his friends and stuff like that. And I think that's a very real thing that happened. It certainly happened to me. And so it's subtle, it's never lampshaded, but it was just one more way I was like, okay, someone really understands trauma who made this episode.
Yeah, I don't know specifically like who involved
Mm-hmm.
created like those aspects of it, but I'm glad you're saying that, because to me as an outsider to these types of situations, it felt realistic,
Right.
and I think that's part of what makes this episode so effective, is that yeah, I think like the Nog being a jerk aspect, or at least not to be judgmental, but like rejecting his friend's help,
Yeah.
right, is a very powerful setup to this whole situation.
Very much so. And I will say, I don't know anything about his specifics, but Ronald D. Moore, who, as you said, was very involved in this episode in Star Trek, but then also went on to be I think either the showrunner or the head writer, or someone very involved with the making of Battlestar Galactica. And that is 100% about a military. And I've heard him talk at times that one of his frustrations with Star Trek is that he couldn't really just flat out call Starfleet a military, and that he wanted to deal with like the mental side of military trauma. So clearly it's something he's had a large interest in, and so I imagine he's had some background or some experience, or at least some research he's done into that.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, even if you don't have firsthand experience necessarily, like if you do the research, like we talked about this with Full Metal Alchemist, where the author Arakawa did a lot of research and talked to war veterans, and especially those with injuries, to get their perspective on all of that. And that's like all we ask is, like, even if we talk about media and how like representation is important, and how having people who have the lived experiences can deliver better, more authentic stories. That doesn't mean that people outside of those experiences can't write about these subjects.
Yeah.
But it means you have to have an extra level of responsibility to do the research, talk to people who have experienced it, and to try to understand, and not just like project your own, like, oh, I think this is what it would be like.
Yeah. I've hinted about this before, but I don't think I've been able to go into detail before because the book hadn't come out yet. But the new Brandon Sanderson novel in the Stormlight Archives, Wind and Truth, if you go through the acknowledgement page, and most people don't, I never would either, so I don't blame you if you didn't. But if you do go through it, you'll see prosthetics and disability expert Matthew Fox.
Oh,
because, and it was exactly what you're talking about, because I know someone who's a beta reader for him, and he apparently is very good about this. And he had a character who lost a leg and used a prosthetic during the course of the book. And he sent me those chapters and had me kind of make comments on them. And I'm very proud that like they changed a lot of the way the story was structured for him based on the comments I made, where I was like, this is realistic, this isn't, and stuff like that. And again, fitting into his magical world. But and I think that's really cool. And I think that more and more authors doing that is so needed.
That is awesome to hear for you, but also just like for the industry and for Brandon Sanderson. That fits with my understanding of him.
Yeah.
Is that I believe he's Mormon, right?
Yeah, he is.
But he has written LGBTQ characters and has talked to people in the community, I believe, about that issue. And it's kind of a conflicting situation because of his faith, but he still tries to like listen to communities and to try to depict accurate representations, is my understanding.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's obviously a lot of complications there and controversy and stuff like that, but I think in terms of how he deals with this issue, it's really kind of like setting a standard. So, all right, let me get back to the Esri part of it. Because did you rewatch the episode, or let me ask you that? Because part of what I noticed when I rewatched it just last night is I think you were right that for most of the episode, Esri is portrayed as kind of, she's the by the book person. She's doing what she's been told is supposed to be helpful, but clearly she doesn't have this experience herself. And for most of the episode, the story is about how Vic Fontaine is helping him. But we get to a point where that shifts. And I want to actually read a quote from a friend of ours who commented on when I put this question out to people. Where the hell was it? Hold on a second. Patrick Cool wrote, the way the episode addresses the transition from giving Nog the space to grieve to acknowledging that Nog is no longer grieving and is instead wallowing in his own self-pity is incredible. The fine line between holding space and enabling is one that is too often ignored. And I want to talk about that in general, but just that one, it is Esri who points out to Fontaine, hey, you've kind of crossed this line. You're now into enabling territory. And Fontaine listens to her, and that's what able to help him give Nog the final push. So I agree it's still not a great representation of mental health professionals, but I do think it's significantly better than we often would get.
No, you're right. That's an excellent point. Yeah. It's just I think like in the context of a therapist, right? Like I what I'm disappointed by in the depictions in Star Trek is like there are very few like good therapy sessions, and
Yeah,
it's usually just like the therapist like not getting through or the person not sharing and then like storming off and talking to the bartender or the hollow
right.
character. So that yeah, okay. I can see where Patrick is coming from.
Yeah.
That is a very good turn.
Yeah, and I think part of it's a TV problem because somewhat by definition, like a therapist shouldn't have that a therapist's circle of friends shouldn't be their patients. Like that's just a boundaries issue. But
Hmm.
on a
Yeah.
show where it's like this, you want the Balana Troy character, you want
Deanna.
the Esri character to be part of the circle of friends of the ensemble, and so it's just fundamentally a mix. But yeah, like what do you think of this idea of like that shift from he's there and it's helping him, but then like there gets to a point where he needs to go on from that, and he has trouble seeing that.
Yeah, I think it is accurate to real life situations, but obviously like given the circumstances of this fictional world, you can't stay in the hollow suite forever because it's not real. And
Right.
that's often a phrasing that gets used about any situation like this. Like if you get super involved in a MMORPG,
Right.
and it's like you're spending too much time, like that's not real, that's not real life, right?
Right.
In this case, like the holosuite feels real because you're interacting with it, and it visually and tactfully feels like the real world, but it's not. And I think that's like the distinction that ultimately has to be drawn for the sake of the character and for the TV show. You can't just have the rest of the season play out with Nog sitting in the holosuite forever.
Right.
But the way they do it is excellent and
Hmm.
somewhat heartbreaking to me.
Yeah.
Like when Vig just shuts himself off, I think we're going to transition into this discussion of what the heck is Vic Fontaine.
Hmm.
um, but yeah, like obviously Nog can't stay there.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting because I do think like this topic of like internet addiction and like losing yourself in games and stuff is such a difficult one because and I feel like this sometimes. Like I feel like there are things in the world where I recognize that they can be dangerous, but I also recognize that the people yelling loudest about them are often pretty terrible and don't get it, you know? And so when it comes to things like, you know, I do think people can smoke too much pot, or that people can like get too into porn and it really kind of like start to, change how they're interacting with people or stuff like that. Or like think of other things like that. But the fact is that like the people who are attacking those things just think that they're fundamentally evil instead of recognizing that no, like pot can be really good for you for in a lot of ways, or like porn can be a completely healthy way that people enjoy sexuality. As long as it doesn't come something you're like losing yourself in, and where's that line of losing yourself? That's really hard to find. And I feel very similar about this, and that I do think there are people who really suffer because they kind of focus all of their social energy and attention and focus into online worlds with people they know online. But I also know that like people have gotten married, people have built families and communities, and I know especially during COVID, a lot of those like MMOs or other things like that really saved people's lives. And and yeah, and so like I think you're right. It is a good translation of that issue, and I appreciate that they by allowing there to be some real value and healthiness that comes from Nog being at Vic Fontaine's, but then eventually realizing that this is a crutch, that it can't be his forever, and he has to move on. I just thought that was a brilliant way of like not falling to either side, not falling into like, oh, it's all bad kind of thing that often happens.
Yeah, because Star Trek has already dealt with that in Next Generation with the character of Lieutenant Barclay,
Right.
who had like I think they call it like hollow addiction,
Yeah.
where he was using the holodeck in an unhealthy way to play out various fantasies and like revenge fantasies against his coworkers, crewmates, and stuff.
Right. Yeah, and I liked those episodes, but I thought they were very heavy-handed. And I think this is just a much more sort of deft touch that is aware of sort of both sides.
No, I agree. And I think so much of it is the character of Vic. And I don't think we've mentioned it. He's played by James Darren,
Mhm.
who was a prominent star like in the 50s and 60s. He was in Gidget and The Time Tunnel,
Mhm.
are like the other credits that I see that I recognize and remember. I remember watching The Time Tunnel.
Right.
So not like when it was live, but I
Yeah, I think
watched reruns.
I don't think he ever actually ran with Frank Sinatra and the Brat Pack, but he's definitely like he is a legit crooner of that kind of age. And
He's like even in this episode in Deep Space Nine, he is a good-looking man, like maybe 60s at this point.
yeah, you want if the dictionary under Silver Fox has a picture of him, that is not a problem.
Yeah,
And he's a phenomenal singer. Like you
yeah.
realize like why people like that kind of crooner jazz, you know, kind of idea.
Oh my
And
God. His Wikipedia page, like his profile pic, is a
uh-huh.
picture from the time tunnel, which was in the 60s. And like he's just giving this super intense look, and I just can't I can't look at him anymore. He's
I love
so
it. I love it.
oh swoon.
Well, yeah, he's great, and his singing is wonderful. But in this episode, until now, like a lot of holodeck characters, and I think like Guinan, he's mostly there to be a plot device for other characters, to give them the note of wisdom that they need, or to give them a place to have fun and escape to. And I really love, and I really noticed on this rewatch, how much it is about him as well. Because one of the things that I think comes up, and as a friend who has been through trauma, but often helps people with trauma as well, I think this is very, very true. One of the reasons why therapists have strong boundaries is because when you are a friend who's kind of acting like a therapist and you are helping someone and someone is getting better because of you, that's incredible for your ego. That feels
Mm,
wonderful. And acknowledging that that is over and they don't need you anymore and that maybe you should stop doing that is not easy. And we have a word for that,
fair.
codependency. Like that's literally the definition, or it's one part of the definition. I'm not an expert there, but like, and again, that's never stated in anything but the most passing terms. But there is a moment where Ezri kind of says, like, "You're really enjoying this in some way," and he's like, "Yeah, I guess maybe that's true." And you're right. The way he does it is he kind of has to take this tough love attitude because it seems like nothing else is working. But I just really appreciate that they show that, yeah, it's not just that Vic missed that this was no longer good for Nog. It's that Vic's getting something out of it too, and that's no longer healthy for Nog. And that
Yeah.
for Vic to have to do that is hurtful to Vic as well. And
Mm,
because as he says, like I've been kept on 24 hours. I'm getting to have a life and interact with people and not just be, the giver of a nugget of wisdom and then I sing a song and then I go away. And I
yeah.
both just in terms of acknowledging that trauma relationship of the helpful friend, but also acknowledging like this is a step forward for photonic life, artificial life, as they did with the Doctor in Voyager and other things like that. I just love it.
I love it too for the character of Vic. I am mystified by the technology and what he is.
Oh, there's
Right?
no
Because
rhyme or reason to technology.
the Doctor in Voyager makes a lot more sense
Right.
because from the beginning of the show, the conceit is like he was an emergency medical hologram, but all of their doctors die and they have to keep him online. Like
Right.
so he has to become a member of the crew. And there are various episodes where they like add subroutines to his personality and like improve his
Mhm.
holodeck technology. He gets the mobile emitter so that he can leave the holodeck, etc. There's none of that with Vic, and all of a sudden he's just a very real person
Yeah.
in the best way, like as a character. But I'm like, where did all this come from? Like, what is going on here?
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting. And part of the idea, as I said, is that Vic not only like is enjoying the feeling of being the friend to Nog, but also that he gets to like play poker with he gets to do all the things off screen. You know,
Yeah,
that
exactly.
because if you think about like, yeah, a character appears on screen, if they only exist in the moments that they're on screen, they're the NPC, you know? And like,
Yes.
but what does the NPC get to do with the rest of his life? Here he gets to have the rest of his life. And Nog, as a way of saying thank you, works out this idea of that the program will keep running all the time so that he gets to keep living a life and doing all of these things. Um and yeah, I think the way they use the holodeck to in individual episodes or individual arcs answer these interesting questions is really cool. But I think you have to acknowledge that that there's absolutely no scientific rhyme or reason
No, there's
to how
not.
the holodeck works. It does not make any sense.
And the reason I get hung up on it is because Star Trek as a franchise does try to explain itself and the science more, even if it's technobabble. They
Right.
add that technobabble to explain like why this thing works this way. And Vic is never really adequately explained to my satisfaction.
Hmm.
But I don't know, like we just we roll with it and we benefit. Like just think about the two main characters on this episode, Nog and Vic. They're the centerpieces, like all of the emotional beats like are about
Hmm.
them. Neither one of these characters is a main character, right? Like neither one of these
Oh yeah.
actors appears in the opening credits of, I don't know, like 7 or 8 people who are like the regulars.
Yeah.
Nog at this point is like kind of a semi-regular, and like Vic is probably like a guest
Hmm.
star, I would say. But to be able to center an entire episode on two secondary or even tertiary, in Vic's case, characters, amazing. Like
Yeah.
this is the kind of like what people derisively call filler, but I think of
Hmm.
as character episodes that I
Yeah.
miss in television.
I really do. And part of it is I think it's often called filler. I think another thing that's often thought of is that, and again, I don't know the details, but my understanding is that a lot of times, like a TV show would create an episode like this that really only focuses on one or two characters, and sometimes they're main cast and sometimes they're not. But part of it's to be able to like give other people like a week off, you know, like most of the characters probably could come in for one day of work for this season, for this episode, because they're not in anywhere near as much of it as they might normally be. And yeah, and I just think that they're great, and I love that even when other characters do play a role, it's Esri and Miles O'Brien. You know, Cisco has almost nothing to do in this episode. Odo, Quark, like each of them have like 5 lines maximum.
Mhm.
And O'Brien has, I think, one of my favorite lines in the show, and this goes back to the stuff about Fontaine, because Nog is talking to O'Brien about like Fontaine, because at one point Fontaine is so determined to like send Nog out into the regular world that Fontaine himself turns off his program and
Yeah,
makes it so that Nog can
again,
work.
like completely technologically illogical
Yeah,
for the computer to turn itself off, because that's what
right.
he is. Like he is the computer.
Well, and a great way of acknowledging that, I thought, Nog asks Miles O'Brien, "You mean he has free will?" Meaning Vic, and Miles says, "I'm an engineer, not a philosopher."
Right. That's a good dodge for
It's
the
just such a
writers.
good dodge. It's a nice callback to Bones, you know, damn it, I'm a doctor,
Yes,
not a
yeah.
this. But it's also just a nice way of being like, yeah, these people don't understand.
Yeah.
They're just the technicians, and
I
that's
don't
great.
know.
Yeah.
And I like the person podcasting right now don't know either. That's the
Yeah.
thing. Is like what does this mean for him and for like computers in Star Trek?
Yeah. Well, and not to get all woke about this, but I think there's actually another powerful lesson in that, because it is, I think, the storyteller somewhat saying, don't worry how many angels are dancing on the pin. Let's talk about the fact that the angels are dancing salsa. Like that's the
Mhm.
thing I want you to focus on.
Yeah.
And is a way of saying don't focus on it.
Yeah.
But I also think there's something important when it comes to the idea of, you know, diversity and of learning about new races and new cultures and new peoples. of sometimes saying it's okay if I don't fully understand this, I can respect it. And that goes for everything from, you know, other people don't necessarily, I will often say, like, hey, please don't push my wheelchair. And I can
Mm.
tell that people don't understand that. They don't get why I wouldn't want their help, even like if I'm going up a hill and they can see that I'm struggling. And to me, what I really appreciate is the people who can say, I don't understand, but I will respect that. And in the same way that, like, when you tell me about something that's really important to you or someone else from any other culture that's not, I'll appreciate if someone takes the time to help me understand, but I don't need that. All someone has to say is, hey, this is important to me. Please respect that. And I'm going to respect that. And I don't get to understand it necessarily. And I just, I don't know if that's intended or if I'm just reading it in there, but I think it's definitely something that the episode brings up.
Yeah, I interpreted that more as just like, please don't ask questions about this.
Uh-huh.
But I think it's fine. Like, I have questions about it, but it's not in a way that makes me go, like this episode, like they can't even answer this question about hollow sweet characters.
Yep.
Ultimately, yeah, like I don't care because the
Yeah.
the episode is so good. The character himself is so good. Like I would love if there were like a few additional Vic Fontaine episodes
Yeah.
that actually deal with him and like what he is and who he is. But we don't get that. And that's
Yeah.
fine because again, he's like the 10th most important character on Deep Space Nine.
Well, I think part of it is that, and this is kind of goes to a larger statement I've made before, that like, I am fine not caring about the science of something if you don't ask me to care about it. This is
Yes.
why Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure is one of my favorite time travel movies. Because the time travel doesn't make any sense, but they never ask you to believe it makes sense. Whereas, like, when other things say, okay, time travel works like this, and here's the way we're going to logically justify it. Now I feel like if you've invited me into a logical conversation about it, I'm going to point out where your logic breaks down.
Right. When you establish rules and then immediately break them yourself
Right.
is the problem.
Like, there's a whole set of episodes in Star Trek Next Generation, because they love Data loves the Sherlock Holmes program, where Moriarty becomes self-aware.
Yeah.
And they keep trying to establish, like, here are the rules of the holodeck, and then breaking them. And it's just so frustrating. And so I just like this more, that it's like, here's Vic Fontaine. Why does he do this? I don't know. We're not philosophers. We're just telling a story.
Yeah. And it's just, yeah, is a fully realized character. That's the amazing thing. Because I think it's after this, he has another great episode where he plays like a romantic consultant to Odo
Yeah.
and helps him establish a romantic relation with Kira.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, it amazes me that they were able to do this on this show with this character. Because if you said, like, here's a future sci-fi show and they have a 1950s crooner character in a hollow suite and he's going to have like these very important episodes, I would be like, what are you even
Yeah.
talking about?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense, but it works.
Yeah. I think it's true. Well, I'm going to wrap up here. A couple quick things of business I want to say to all of y'all. First of all, I've been putting this out there on social media more, but we are generally going to be recording every Thursday at 12 noon Central Time, and
Right
it is on
now.
YouTube. You can find the tapes of them on YouTube, but if you sign in at that time, you can be here live. You can make comments. You can join in the conversation. Next week, we're going to be doing our core episode. The episode itself will only be released to members, but anyone can jump into the live stream. And it's going to be about another one of these core questions of superhero ethics, this time about who holds authority over superheroes, who should or shouldn't have accountability, or should anyone have accountability over superheroes. We'll be talking about Marvel Civil War. We'll be talking about a lot of those stories that get into this question of, Watchmen and like who watches the Watchers and all this kind of stuff. So jump in next week if you want. That'll be Thursday, February 13th at 12 noon Central Time. You can also find all of our Star Wars episodes at 5:30 p.m. Central Time on Wednesdays. We do other episodes sometimes and try and announce those every week. Of course, if you do want to join the membership program, and that way you can get free access to That way you can get access to ad-free content, to bonus content at the end of every episode. We're about to do some bonus content ourselves on the idea of how trauma is dealt with in other media, and also uh, bonus episodes. Once a month, you get a whole entire episode only for members. Please become a member. It's only $5 a month, $55 a year. All that information is in the show notes. Please take a look at that. Please take a look at all the other ways you can help support us. But most importantly, we have spoken. All right, welcome back, members. So obviously, we're talking about this as kind of a great example of how post-combat trauma is dealt with in characters on shows like this. And unfortunately, part of why it stands out is that this is pretty rare, especially for 20 years ago when this episode, or almost 30 years ago when this episode came out. Shows have gotten better about it now, but not often. Ricky, what are other examples you can think of where it was either handled well or handled badly, but where this topic came up?
So I think a lot of the media, the PTSD media, so to speak, was after like the Vietnam War, dealing with the veterans who returned from Vietnam and may have had injuries or just had PTSD and dealing with that. Like, I remember The Deer Hunter growing up. It was like, I think, an Oscar-winning film with a bunch of amazing actors.
Born on the 4th of July with Tom Cruise, Oliver Stone movie. Really looking
yes, that was the other one I was going to mention. Was that also Vietnam?
Yeah.
Born on the 4th of July. One of Tom Cruise's best performances. I really enjoy Tom Cruise as a performer, but this was like one of his best dramatic roles, right? Like these days he's known more for action, and he really brought it in that movie. I think like for media, like more recent media, and especially kind of in the superhero genre, Iron Man 3 stands out as an interesting one. It's not, I mean, it's not war per se, right? But Tony Stark is dealing with PTSD from the Battle of New York.
Yeah.
Where the Avengers fought the Chitauri. And especially of like he keeps going back to that moment where he flies with the nuclear missile into the wormhole.
Yeah.
And then kind of like is in space and thinks he's gonna die and falls backwards and luckily falls back through the wormhole as it's closing to Earth. And just like that feeling of like I could have died there. Like they have several scenes where he has these intense flashbacks to that and then like kind of wakes up from it in a cold sweat.
Yeah.
And it's Iron Man 3 is like not my favorite movie, like Marvel movie. But I'm glad that they made that in that way to deal with that, because it's mentioned a few other times throughout the Iron Mans and Avengers movies of like him dealing with that.
Yeah.
But that was like the most extended depiction of it was in that movie.
And I'll say that is one thing that I do think that I don't love how Star Trek handled it, but I think the MCU did really well. Because if you asked me how would I improve upon the Nog storyline, the only thing I'd say is I would spread it out more. I'd have a couple of those scenes of Nog having trouble readjusting and dealing with people happen as like one-off moments in other episodes. And then maybe like 3 episodes later, he goes to Vic because he's gotten so frustrated with it, just to show that like it doesn't all happen in one episode. And then maybe he stays in Vic's over like 2 or 3 episodes where it's not the entire focus. And
yeah,
you're right. I think Iron Man 3 is the episode about that. But he makes Ultron because of PTSD.
Yeah,
like, it is a direct one-to-one comparison. He does the things in Civil War he does in part because of what he did in Ultron. Like, you know, it's all there's so much to that happens. And that kind of ties into another example I'm going to give, which is Battlestar Galactica. Which have you seen, Ricky?
Yeah, I watched the whole thing pretty much when it was on TV on the Sci-Fi Channel. I think I went and rewatched season 1, but I haven't been able to go back and watch the rest because it's so heavy and because it has like so many of these depictions of trauma.
Yeah,
it is a very good show and portrays like all of these things very realistically. but that can also make it hard to watch or hard to rewatch if you know what's coming. And
Yeah.
like I know that like there are these key moments that happen. I'm like, I don't know if I want to put myself through that.
Yeah.
Similar to like Neon Genesis Evangelion, right? Like I was like, this episode like hits so hard, I had to stop watching the show for like a couple of days because I had to process my emotions.
Yeah.
And Battlestar has like the same quality to it.
Yeah, I definitely think that. I think that like it's something that's often missing from post-apocalyptic things, but like frankly, I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, so take this with a grain of salt. It's meant somewhat superb. Isn't somewhat as hyperbole, but only somewhat. But there's an extent to which like if you go through a humanity, like the decimation of 98% of humanity,
Genocide.
yeah, a genocide of like 98, 99% of humanity, but or it's like a genocide, but like also whether it's like a zombie plague or just like some other kind of like plague, like in The Stand or something like that. But you go through that, I'd argue pretty much every survivor has some kind of PTSD, and to some extent, like Battlestar Galactica and The Walking Dead. But no, what are the I can't remember the name of it now. Oh, The Last of Us. Like The Last of Us to me, as well as Battlestar Galactica, is kind of a show about like every character going through some version of dealing with the trauma and the stress and how they deal with that in all these different terrible ways. I'm trying to think now of other show. To me, another show that I think did this poorly, because they fell into the one trap that I think that Star Trek did, but they also fall into so many other traps, is the Arrowverse. Because what the Arrowverse would do all the time, and overall I like a lot of things in the Arrowverse, but I think a lot of it is very, like, I love to watch it and I love to hate watch it. And it kind of depends on the episode to episode or arc to arc. But like a lot of times, one of the characters would go through something particularly traumatic and would have one episode where they were dealing with their trauma, but then they would be fixed and they'd be right back to normal.
Yeah.
And I was always just, no, you're a fundamentally different person after this. Even if you like are finding a healthier way to integrate that experience into your life, like there's no going back to normal. And so yeah, I think a lot of action movies, I think, and TV shows especially, will do that, where they have like one episode about the trauma and then one episode about the dealing with the trauma, and then you're back to normal, and that just drives me crazy.
Yeah, it can be a problem with TV shows. I want to mention another one that I felt like they did a good job of, as you say, like drawing it out over a couple of episodes, and that's Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yeah.
Where, again, like this show is very old. She dies at the end of one of the seasons, and then because there's magic in this world, she's brought back to life. And when she's brought back to life, she processes her trauma over several episodes at the beginning of that season.
Yeah.
In a very interesting and I think like similar way to the Nog situation, where she starts acting out and like kind of rejects her friends.
Yeah. I think one of
they don't get it.
And to some extent, her feelings there come to a head with the musical episode, Once More with Feeling. And part of why I think that is one of the best episodes of television I've ever seen is because A, it's a musical, and just having your TV characters in a musical, and a very well written and very well performed musical, is always fun. But also, they do this brilliant job of having a number of characters have these tensions that are building between characters, and in some cases there's like lies that get discovered, or just like things that no one wants to admit to each other, and they all come to a head in that one episode, and they all get revealed through song, which is kind of a ridiculous plot point, but they make it work, and the songs are beautiful, and it's such a good way of like, yeah, there's going to be an explosion, there's going to be a time where you have to talk about this, but like in Buffy, it's going to be subtle over a couple of episodes, it's going to slowly build. And to pull it back to Star Trek, I think it's funny that in the same show, in the same character, I think you have both a good and a bad example of this. I'm talking about The Next Generation and Jean-Luc Picard. Because one of the things that happens in Star Trek, I think it's the end of season, I think it might be the end of season 2, I don't remember. It's one of the earliest seasons. He gets kidnapped by the Borg, and like it fundamentally, it really screws him up and gives him a version of PTSD or however you want to call it. And that's kind of him getting past that to some extent is kind of the focus of First Contact, the movie. But there's a number of instances where it happens before then, and there's a number of instances where it happens after that. Like a number of times we see that his feelings about the Borg aren't always like the most perfectly rational because of all the emotional damage that experience did to him. And I think it's one of the best depictions of dealing with trauma that I've seen.
Yeah. In the First Contact movie, his Captain Ahab outburst, "The line must be drawn here no further,"
Right.
is
Exactly.
just like him raging out, like, and being unable to control his emotions regarding the situation. And
Yeah.
he gets called out on it. And that's what kind of brings him back. He goes, You're right. Like I'm not being
Yeah.
rational."
But we've seen that in so many episodes leading up to that, and even after it, like even in the Picard show, it comes up that like, yeah, he's better after First Contact, but it's not totally gone. But then the flip side, I think one of the worst examples that I've seen, where I'm both glad that it got dealt with, but also it could have been so much more, is he also becomes a prisoner of the Cardassians, and they literally try to psychologically torture him. The phrase "there are four lights" will mean a lot to anyone who's seen that episode. It's a very hard one to take. And in what I think was a really great like breakthrough moment, they don't have him just go back to being fine after that episode. There's a whole episode of him being in France with his brother at the vineyard, dealing with his feelings about that and dealing with a lot of the other traumas in his life as a soldier for 30 years that he's dealt with. And I love that.
That's actually the episode Family is after the Borg kidnapping. So the Borg kidnapping happens at the end of season 3 into season 4, and then the first episode after that is Family, where he goes to see his brother at the
No,
vineyard,
you're
and
right. Okay,
they
so
have the
actually,
little.
they do have
They do completely ignore his torture, in my opinion.
okay, so it's both the good part was even better than I thought,
Yes.
and the bad
Yes.
one was even worse than I thought. Similarly, he lives 50 years of this horrific experience watching his entire planet die.
But
then, like,
he lives a beautiful life with a family too. The
right.
inner light.
He gets to have all the things that he didn't get to have. Gets to have the family and children and grandchildren, and then watch his world die. And then he plays a flute about it every now and then because of it. Like it's just so inconsistent how they said like, okay, this trauma counts, and this one we're really going to talk about, but these others, not so much.
But all of the best episodes of The Next Generation are where they said, well, we've got this great actor, Patrick Stewart. What if we just let him act for 45 minutes?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there was some good acting from a number of the other characters, but I do think that Patrick Stewart was just in a class above,
I mean, he
any.
is.
Yeah.
No, yeah, absolutely, like, no disrespect. Like, I enjoy a good Data episode. I think Brent Spiner does a great job, especially with the limitations of that character's personality.
Yeah.
But that show was the Patrick Stewart show. He's phenomenal.
And I do think it's funny that like that's not the only geek focused franchise that's happened with, because the original Chris Carpenter X-Men movies are a lot of fun and I think do some really fun things. But for a lot of those movies, it's I may have said Chris Carpenter incorrectly, so we talk about that in a second. But
yeah, I was like, where did you pull that name from?
No, think of someone else. But anyway, I'll just redo that. And I'll leave that in. But yeah, the point being that for those movies, all the other actors are fine. And like I do think that Hugh Jackman does a great job of Wolverine, and Hugh Jackman goes on to be, I think, a really good actor. But you sort of get the sense that like Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen are these two like world-class actors who decided to join like a college acting troupe for a couple movies, because they're just on such a different level from what everyone else is doing in those movies. So yeah, Patrick Stewart's now done that in 2 different franchises.
Yeah. So the X-Men movies were Bryan Singer.
Okay.
Who is now a problematic individual who hopefully is shunned from all future projects.
Mm,
And I believe, like, in some cases, they have intentionally not used characters or names or something to not give him residuals because
interesting.
of how bad he was.
Okay.
Were you thinking of Chris Claremont? I don't know, who was the
Yeah,
X-Men writer.
I think Chris Claremont, because he was the one who sort of took the X-Men into more of
Yeah,
the LGBT
absolutely.
metaphor, which is done in those original movies. That's
Yeah,
probably what I was thinking of.
because I was like, Chris Carpenter. I think he was a Major League Baseball pitcher
He may have been part of the group
for
of
the St.
Carpenters.
Louis
Right?
Cardinals.
So
One
okay,
of my other passions, by the way, folks.
yes.
Like, I have
With
a lot of
baseball coming up soon, I think we're definitely gonna do an episode about the ethics of being a sports fan,
ooh,
because the questions surrounding them, between the capitalism and the players, and as we're recording this today, I was watching a bunch of TikToks about Travis Kelce being excited that Trump was coming to the Super Bowl, and Jalen Hurts very much not being, and a lot of people having thoughts about that. We'll definitely get into the ethics of sports fandom, because I think there's a lot of good things to say there.
and maybe gambling, because
Oh yeah.
it's ridiculous to me that you can have your sport sponsored by DraftKings and then ban players for gambling.
I was pretty strong on the idea of Pete Rose should have been banned. But I think the day that sports gambling became legal and acceptable and sponsored by Major League Sports, I think, yeah, Pete Rose and Shoeless Jackson put them back in.
Yeah.
So,
So
all right.
we will expand on that in a future episode.
Exactly. All right. Well, members, thank you all so much. You're what keeps the lights on. Riki, thank you so much for all your time. We have spoken.